A lingering shadow. The afternoon sun cast golden light across the playground of Little Sprouts Daycare, creating long shadows as children played, their laughter ringing through the air. Jessica Monroe, a 28-year-old caregiver with 5 years of experience, smiled as she watched the children climb, slide, and chase each other in an endless loop of boundless energy. It was a scene she loved, a place where kids could be safe, where they were encouraged to be themselves, and where the worries of the world outside had no place. But as the clock on the daycare wall ticked closer to 6 o'clock, signaling the end of another busy day, an unease settled deep in her chest. It was subtle at first, a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, but it grew stronger when she noticed one particular child, Lena Carter. Lena, a quiet 5-year-old with wide hazel eyes and an ever-present pink stuffed bunny, stood alone near the jungle gym, watching the gate with a tense expression. Unlike the other children, who grew excited when their parents arrived, Lena seemed hesitant, her small fingers clutching the ears of her stuffed toy with a grip so tight her knuckles turned white. Jessica frowned. This wasn't the first time she had noticed Lena's behavior during pickup. While some kids struggled with transitions, Lena's reluctance felt different, like fear. It was a reaction Jessica had learned to recognize over the years, a silent distress signal only noticeable to those who cared enough to look. She approached the little girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, Lena," Jessica said, crouching to her level. "Are you excited to see your mom or dad today?" Lena's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then she quickly clamped them shut. Her hazel eyes darted toward the daycare entrance before she whispered, I don't know." Jessica's stomach tightened. Something about the way she hesitated sent warning bells ringing in her head. Before she could ask another question, the front door buzzed, indicating that a parent had arrived. Lena flinched at the sound, her body going rigid. Jessica instinctively turned toward the reception area, where parents signed in for pickup. A tall man in a dark gray coat stood at the entrance, signing in through the daycare's new electronic system. He had sharp features, a strong jawline, and piercing blue eyes that flicked around the room before settling on Lena. His expression was unreadable, but something about his posture made Jessica's pulse quicken. It was Lena's father. Jessica had only seen him a few times before, unlike most parents, who stayed for small talk or to observe their child playing before heading home. Mr. Carter was always in and out, no nonsense, little conversation. He never lingered, never showed any outward signs of warmth toward Lena. But it wasn't just his efficiency that unsettled Jessica. It was the way Lena reacted to him. Now, as soon as she saw him, Lena took a step back, as if she wanted to disappear into the shadows. Jessica rose slowly, keeping her voice light. "Lena, sweetie, your dad's here." The little girl didn't move. Mr. Carter approached, his footsteps measured. "Come on, Lena. Time to go." Lena clutched the pink stuffed bunny tighter, her breathing shallow. Jessica had seen children throw tantrums before, had watched them cry and beg to stay at daycare rather than go home. But this was different. This wasn't just a child upset about leaving her friends. This was fear. Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the interaction. Every instinct in her screamed that something was wrong. "I forgot something inside," Lena blurted, her voice small. Mr. Carter exhaled, a sharp, impatient sound. "Lena, let's go." Jessica cleared her throat, keeping her expression neutral but her voice firm. "If she forgot something, I can go get it for her." For a moment, Mr. Carter's eyes flicked to Jessica, as if assessing whether she was challenging him. Then he gave a stiff nod. "Fine. Make it quick." Jessica turned to Lena. "What did you forget, sweetheart?" The little girl hesitated, looking at Jessica with something that almost seemed like a silent plea. Then, so quietly that Jessica barely heard it, she whispered, "Nothing." Jessica's gut twisted. She knew kids well enough to understand when they were lying. And Lena wasn't just lying. She was scared. Her mind raced as she tried to decide what to do. Without solid proof of wrongdoing, She couldn't stop Mr. Carter from taking his daughter home. But she couldn't ignore what she was seeing either. If she let Lena leave, would she regret it? Jessica forced herself to smile at the little girl, crouching once more. "Okay, sweetheart. Maybe next time you can bring a list so you don't forget anything." Lena's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Jessica looked back at Mr. Carter. "Could you sign her out in the system, please? Just a quick formality." He sighed, reaching into his pocket for his phone. As he scanned the Daycare's app, Jessica suddenly took a step to the side, angling herself so she could see the phone screen. The login wasn't his. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she quickly registered the name on the screen. Maylene Carter, Lena's mother. Why was he logged in under his wife's credentials? Jessica had no time to question it. The sign-out was complete, and Mr. Carter reached for Lena's wrist. She flinched as his fingers wrapped around her small hand. A jolt of something cold shot down Jessica's spine. She watched as Lena's eyes flickered toward her one last time, pleading, silent. Then, just like that, they were gone. Jessica stood frozen, her mind racing. Everything about that interaction felt wrong. She turned toward the front desk, where another caregiver was sorting out sign-outs for other children. "Hey, do you know if Lena's mom usually picks her up?" The other woman frowned. "Yeah, most days. She used to come in all the time." "Why?" Jessica hesitated, then shook her head. "Just curious." She needed to find out more. Something was gnawing at her, something deep and insistent. Without another word, Jessica made a decision. She grabbed her keys, and she followed them. The road of no return. Jessica's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she followed the red sedan down the road, her heart pounding in her chest. The suburban streets of Oak Ridge were quiet this evening, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, but there was an eerie weight pressing down on her as she drove. She wasn't supposed to do this. It was against every daycare protocol to follow a parent home. But as she watched Lena's reluctant steps and the fear hidden behind her wide hazel eyes, Jessica knew she couldn't just let it go. The traffic lights ahead turned yellow, and Jessica instinctively slowed down, watching as Mark Carter's vehicle picked up speed and pushed through the light just as it turned red. She cursed under her breath. It was almost as if he knew he was being followed and wanted to shake off anyone trailing him. Jessica debated for a split second before making a rash decision. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal and sped through the intersection just as the light switched completely to red. The adrenaline rushed through her veins as she checked her rearview mirror, hoping no police officers had caught her. The sedan continued down the road before taking a turn onto a less busy street lined with tall trees. Jessica had been a daycare worker for years, and she had encountered difficult parents before, overprotective mothers, neglectful fathers, and even those who barely showed up. But something about Mark Carter made her skin crawl. It wasn't just Lena's fear that had set off alarms in her mind. It was his body language, the way he had gripped his daughter's wrist too tightly, the impatience in his voice, and most of all, the way he had seemed uneasy when Jessica had asked about signing Lena out. Why would he be using his wife's credentials unless he had a reason to? The road stretched on, and Jessica realized that they were no longer heading towards the neighborhood where she knew the Carters lived. Her fingers tightened on the wheel as she watched the car ahead make a sharp turn onto a gravel road that led towards a wooded area. Jessica hesitated for a moment. Should she keep going? Should she stop now and call the police? But what would she even tell them? That a father had picked up his daughter from daycare and decided to take a detour. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't suspicious, at least not in the eyes of the law. But something deep in her gut told her this was wrong. She swallowed hard and made the turn, careful to keep a safe distance behind the red car. The trees loomed overhead, the light dimming as the sun dipped lower beyond the horizon. The road became rougher, bumpier, and Jessica had to slow down to keep control of her vehicle. Mark's car continued deeper into the wooded area, the taillights flickering through the thickening shadows. Then, suddenly, the car came to a stop. Jessica's breath hitched as she instinctively turned off her headlights and pulled her car to a halt behind a cluster of trees, making sure she wasn't visible. She watched through her windshield as the driver's side door opened, and Mark Carter stepped out, adjusting his jacket before walking over to the passenger side. The air felt thick, suffocating, as Jessica strained to see what was happening. Lena hesitated before climbing out of the car. Jessica could see the way the little girl clutched her pink stuffed bunny against her chest as though it were her only lifeline. She wasn't crying, but there was something rigid about her posture, something unnatural about the way she moved, as if she was trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Mark leaned down and said something to his daughter. Jessica couldn't hear from this distance, but whatever it was, Lena stiffened. He then took her small hand and began walking towards the tree line. Jessica's heartbeat roared in her ears. Where was he taking her? Why would he bring his daughter to an isolated area like this? No houses, no buildings, just endless trees. She felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. This wasn't right. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and opened the camera app, zooming in on them as she started recording. She needed evidence, something to show the police, something concrete to justify why she was here. Mark led Lena deeper into the woods, his grip firm on her tiny hand. Jessica's mind raced. Was this a disciplinary tactic? A twisted attempt at scaring the child into obedience? The thought made her stomach churn. But before she could consider what to do next, something happened that made her blood run cold. Lena pulled against her father's grip. She didn't just hesitate, she actively struggled. Jessica saw the way the little girl's feet dug into the dirt as she shook her head violently. Her tiny voice carried faintly through the trees, trembling with fear. "No, Daddy, please. I don't want to go." Jessica's hands trembled as she held her phone, watching with horror as Mark bent down and gripped Lena's shoulders tightly, his face mere inches from hers. Jessica couldn't make out the words, but whatever he was saying made Lena whimper, her body shaking like a leaf in the wind. Jessica couldn't stay silent anymore. She flung open her car door and stepped out, clutching her phone like a weapon. Her voice rang through the quiet evening. "Mark, what are you doing?" Mark's head snapped up, his entire body going rigid. Lena turned toward Jessica, her hazel eyes wide, desperate. For a moment, everything was still. The wind rustled through the trees, the distant hum of cicadas filling the silence. Then, Mark's expression darkened. He stood slowly, releasing Lena's shoulders. His icy blue eyes locked onto Jessica's with a mix of irritation and something far more dangerous. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Jessica took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay steady. Lena left her stuffed bunny at daycare. I was just trying to return it. It was a weak excuse, and Mark knew it. His jaw clenched. That's bullshit. Jessica's stomach twisted. She had no plan, no weapon, no backup. She was just a daycare worker who had followed a man into the woods based on a gut feeling. And now, she was standing in front of a man who looked like he wanted to tear her apart. She glanced down at Lena, who was still holding her stuffed bunny, her small body trembling. Jessica forced herself to focus on the child. "Lena," she said softly, "are you okay?" The little girl opened her mouth as if to answer, but then quickly clamped it shut and looked at her father. Jessica saw it, the fear, the silent warning in her eyes. And suddenly, she understood. Mark wasn't just strict. He was dangerous, and Lena had been trying to tell her all along. Jessica swallowed hard. She had a choice. She could walk away now, pretend she had seen nothing, leave this little girl to fend for herself against whatever horrors lay behind closed doors. Or she could act. Her grip on her phone tightened. She had already come this far. There was no turning back now. Into the shadows. Jessica's heart pounded so loudly that she thought Mark Carter might hear it. The air between them crackled with tension, thick and suffocating. The forest around them had darkened, the last light of the sun filtering weakly through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Lena stood frozen, clutching her stuffed bunny so tightly that her small knuckles turned white. Mark's eyes, sharp as daggers, were locked onto Jessica's, filled with suspicion, annoyance, and something much darker beneath the surface. He took a slow step toward her, his boots crunching against the forest floor, and Jessica instinctively took a step back. "You've got a hell of a lot of nerve, Jessica," Mark muttered, his voice dangerously low. "Following me. Meddling in my family's business." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand her ground despite the creeping fear in her gut. "I wasn't following you," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Lena left her bunny at daycare. I thought she might need it." Mark narrowed his eyes. "And that justified you driving all the way out here, into the woods." His lips curled into a humorless smile. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Jessica knew she was treading on thin ice. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this could go very badly. She forced a small, nervous laugh, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "No, of course not. I just wanted to make sure she was okay." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "She's fine. She's my daughter. You don't need to worry about her." Jessica glanced at Lena, who was staring at the ground, her entire body tense, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Jessica had worked with children long enough to know that this wasn't the reaction of a child who felt safe with her parent. This was the reaction of a child who had learned to survive by being quiet, by not drawing attention to herself. The realization sent a wave of cold dread down Jessica's spine. "You're right," Jessica said carefully, trying to keep her voice neutral. "It's just that she seemed really upset when she left the daycare today." Mark's expression darkened. "Kids throw tantrums all the time," he said dismissively. "You of all people should know that." Jessica hesitated. She could push harder, but she knew it would only provoke him further. She had to be smart about this. She had to find another way. "Of course," she said finally. She glanced back toward the road where her car was parked. "I should probably get going. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Mark studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe her. Then, without another word, he turned and grabbed Lena's wrist, pulling her roughly toward the car. Lena didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply followed, like a puppet with its strings being pulled. Jessica's stomach churned. She had to do something. But what? She was alone, with no proof, and standing against a man who was twice her size. Calling the police wouldn't do much. She had no solid evidence of wrongdoing, only a gut feeling. And gut feelings weren't enough to take a child away from her parent. She needed more. As Mark opened the car door and motioned for Lena to get inside, Jessica made a split-second decision. She reached into her pocket and quickly tapped the record button on her phone, slipping it back in before he could notice. "Hey, Mark," she called out, forcing an easy smile onto her face. "Can I at least say goodbye to Lena?" Mark paused, his grip on the car door tightening. He didn't want to let her get close. That much was clear. "Just for a second," Jessica added, keeping her voice light. "It'd be weird if I just ran off without saying bye, right?" Mark hesitated, then let out an irritated sigh. "Fine. Make it quick." Jessica exhaled in relief and quickly approached, lowering herself to Lena's level. The little girl kept her eyes on the ground, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her hands. "Lena," Jessica said softly, keeping her voice gentle, "I just wanted to say goodbye. I'll see you tomorrow at daycare, okay?" Lena nodded slightly but didn't say anything. Jessica hesitated, then lowered her voice to a whisper. "Sweetheart, if something's wrong, you can tell me." Lena's grip on her bunny tightened. Jessica swallowed hard. "If you ever need help, you can." Before she could finish, Mark's hand clamped down on Lena's shoulder, pulling her back. "That's enough," he said coldly. "We're done here." Jessica stood up slowly, her heart racing as she stepped back. Mark's eyes bore into hers, a silent warning. Then, without another word, he slammed the car door shut, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. Jessica stood frozen as the red sedan roared to life. The tires crunched against the gravel as Mark pulled away, disappearing down the winding road, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Jessica didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind was spinning, her stomach twisting. Something was very, very wrong. And she had just let Lena leave with him. Her fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket and stopped the recording. Her heart pounded as she played it back, listening to the muffled voices, Mark's dismissive tone, her own nervous attempts at conversation, and most importantly, Lena's silence. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jessica exhaled sharply, forcing herself to think. She couldn't just go home and pretend this hadn't happened. She needed to know more. She needed to understand what was going on behind closed doors. Because deep down she knew Lena was in danger. And if Jessica didn't do something about it, no one else would. With renewed determination, she turned and hurried back to her car. She had no concrete plan, no real idea of what she was about to do. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this go. Not until she knew the truth. And not until Lena was safe. The silent cry for help. Jessica gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had barely taken a breath since watching Mark's car disappear down the winding forest road. Her body was frozen, locked in a state of indecision, torn between fear and determination. What was she supposed to do? Everything in her gut screamed that something was wrong, but gut feelings wouldn't hold up in a court of law. She had no proof, no clear evidence that Mark Carter was harming Lena. All she had were the silent cues. The fear in the child's eyes, the way she flinched under her father's touch, the way she had pleaded, "No, Daddy, please," in the woods before Jessica interrupted them. She tapped her fingers against the wheel, her mind racing. There was no way she could just drive home and pretend she hadn't seen anything. If something happened to that little girl, she would never forgive herself. Her gaze flicked to her phone on the passenger seat. The recording was still there, but she knew it wasn't enough. It didn't capture the depth of what she had just witnessed. It didn't show the way Lena's shoulders curled inward like she was trying to make herself as small as possible. It didn't record the way Mark's hand had tightened around her wrist, yanking her away as if she were property, not a child. Jessica needed more. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. 6:52 p.m. If Mark was heading home, he would likely be there within the next 15 minutes. If she drove fast, she could make it there before him, or at least right behind him. Without giving herself time to second-guess, she started the engine and turned her car around. The tires crunched against the gravel as she sped out of the wooded area and back onto the main road. She knew where the Carters lived. She had seen their address in the daycare's files when she checked Lena's information. Their house wasn't far, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood about 5 miles from the daycare. The drive felt longer than it was, her pulse hammering in her ears as she tried to calm her nerves. She forced herself to think logically. What was her plan? She couldn't just park in front of their house and stare at it like some kind of stalker. She needed a reason to be there. Then, an idea struck her. She reached for Lena's stuffed bunny, still sitting in the passenger seat where she had placed it earlier. It was the perfect excuse. She could knock on the door, say she was returning the toy, and get a closer look at what was happening inside. Maybe she would see something, anything, that could confirm her suspicions. As she approached the Carters' neighborhood, she forced herself to slow down, blending in with the other cars parked along the street. The houses here were modest but well-kept, each with neatly trimmed lawns and family cars parked in driveways. It was the kind of place where people waved at their neighbors, where porch lights flickered on at sunset, and where everything seemed normal. But Jessica knew better. She spotted the Carters' house immediately, a small white one-story home with blue shutters and a red car parked in the driveway. Mark had beaten her here. Jessica's heart pounded as she pulled over a few houses away, far enough to avoid drawing attention, but close enough to observe. She killed the engine and sat in the quiet watching. Through the front window, she could see movement inside. Mark's shadow passed by the curtains, his tall frame unmistakable. Then, a second figure appeared. A woman. Jessica inhaled sharply. Lena's mother. She had never met Melleen Carter before, only seen her name on the daycare's records. But the way she stood near the window, tense and unmoving, made Jessica uneasy. There was something unnatural about her posture, like she was waiting for something to happen. Jessica's grip on the stuffed bunny tightened. She had to do this. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of her car and walked up the pathway, her heartbeat pounding against her ribcage like a drum. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. When she reached the front door, she hesitated for only a second before knocking. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the door creaked open, just enough for Jessica to see a pair of wary brown eyes staring back at her. Melleen Carter. Jessica's breath caught. Up close, she could see the deep lines of exhaustion etched into the woman's face. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, and there was a faint bruise on the side of her cheek, barely hidden by the dim lighting. Jessica forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. I'm Jessica Monroe. I work at the daycare where Lena goes." She lifted the stuffed bunny slightly. "Lena left this behind. I thought she might want it." Milleen's eyes flickered to the bunny, and for a brief second, something unreadable passed over her face. Then, before she could say anything, a voice cut through the air. "What's going on?" Jessica's spine stiffened as Mark appeared behind his wife, towering over her. His eyes immediately locked onto Jessica, sharp and suspicious. "She's from the daycare," Melleen murmured, stepping back slightly, as if trying to make herself smaller. "She brought Lena's toy." Mark's gaze flickered to the bunny in Jessica's hands, then back to her face. "You drove all the way here just for that?" His voice was smooth, casual, but there was an underlying tension beneath it. Jessica forced a small smile. "I know how important these little things can be for kids. Some of them can't even sleep without their favorite stuffed animal." She glanced past him, trying to spot Lena. "I just wanted to make sure she got it." Mark studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he stepped aside, opening the door a little wider. "Lena's in her room," he said. "I'll give it to her." Jessica hesitated. If she walked away now, she wouldn't get another chance to see what was really going on. "Actually," she said quickly, "do you mind if I give it to her myself? She was a little upset at daycare today. I just want to make sure she's okay." Mark's jaw twitched, and for the first time, he hesitated. Jessica didn't miss the way Melleen's fingers twitched at her side, almost as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then, finally, Mark sighed. "Fine. Make it quick." Jessica stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. No television, no music, just the faint sound of the air conditioning humming through the vents. The walls were bare, devoid of family photos. The furniture was minimal, the floors spotless, too spotless, as if someone had scrubbed them recently. Mark led her down a short hallway, stopping in front of a closed door. He knocked once, then opened it. "Lena, someone's here for you." Jessica peered inside. Lena was sitting on the edge of a small bed, her pink blanket bunched up around her tiny frame. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Jessica, and then she did something that sent chills down Jessica's spine. She looked at her father. Not at Jessica, not at the stuffed bunny in her hands. At her father, as if she needed permission to react. Jessica's chest tightened. She had her answer. This wasn't just a bad home situation. This was something worse. She knelt down, holding out the bunny. "I brought this for you, sweetheart." Lena hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. Jessica forced a smile. "I'll see you tomorrow at daycare, okay?" Lena's fingers curled around the bunny, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." Jessica exhaled, standing up. She had what she needed. Now she just had to do something about it. A desperate gamble. Jessica forced herself to walk out of Lena's room with measured steps, though every instinct screamed at her to grab the little girl and run. The air inside the Carter house felt heavy, suffocating, like an invisible force pressing against her chest. Mark's presence loomed behind her, his silent footsteps close enough that she could feel the weight of his stare. As she stepped into the hallway, she caught a glimpse of malign Carter standing near the kitchen, her hands clutching the fabric of her long-sleeved sweater as if she were trying to hold herself together. The bruise on her cheekbone was more visible in the dim light now, and Jessica had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. Mark shut Lena's door behind them, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. "Well, now that you've done your good deed, I think it's time you leave," he said, his voice controlled but sharp enough to cut. Jessica nodded quickly, not wanting to provoke him. "Of course. Thanks for letting me say goodnight to her." She turned toward the front door, every step feeling like she was walking through quicksand. As she passed Malene, Jessica slowed just enough to lower her voice. "Are you okay?" The question was barely a whisper. Malene flinched at the words, her eyes darting toward Mark, as if she was terrified he might have heard. She didn't respond, but Jessica caught the way her throat bobbed, her lips parting slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Jessica reached for the doorknob, but Mark was faster. He moved in front of her, blocking the exit, his broad frame casting a shadow over the door. "You should probably mind your own business, Jessica," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You work at a daycare, not social services. I don't need you showing up at my house like some nosy little savior." Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears, but she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. She couldn't let him see how much he intimidated her. "I was just making sure Lena was okay," she said evenly. "That's all." Mark studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then, without a word, he unlocked the door and stepped aside, giving her just enough space to leave. Jessica didn't waste the opportunity. She stepped outside, inhaling the cool evening air as if she'd been holding her breath the entire time. But before she could take another step, Malene's voice, so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind, reached her ears. "Please, don't let her disappear." Jessica froze. She turned slightly, but Malene was already backing away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Mark's expression darkened. "Malene," he warned. Jessica felt her heart slam against her ribs. "Don't let her disappear." Malene wasn't just asking for help. She was begging for it. Jessica forced herself to nod subtly before walking away, her hands shaking as she made her way to her car. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she did, she wasn't sure she'd be able to drive away. Once she was inside her car, she locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, her breath coming in shaky bursts. She couldn't ignore this. She had seen enough cases of abuse in the news to know that by the time people noticed something was wrong, it was often too late. But what could she do? She could call Child Protective Services, but without clear evidence of physical abuse against Lena, there was little they could do immediately. She could go to the police, but Mark hadn't done anything that she could prove. Even if she mentioned the bruise on Malene's face, Malene herself would have to file a complaint. And Jessica was certain that fear would keep her silent. Her hands curled into fists. She needed more. She needed something that no one could ignore. Her eyes flicked to her phone. The recording. She had a small piece of evidence, but it wasn't enough. If she could get more, if she could prove that Mark was hurting his wife or daughter, then she'd have a real case. A reckless plan formed in her mind. A dangerous, desperate plan. She would follow them. Not now, not immediately, but she would keep an eye on the Carter household, watch for patterns, and, if necessary, find a way to get real proof. It was risky. It was insane. But if she did nothing and something happened to Lena, she would never forgive herself. With a deep breath, she started her car and drove off, her mind racing with the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't over. Not even close. 2 days later, Jessica sat in her parked car across from the Carter household, her fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. She hadn't planned on doing this. She really hadn't. But the moment she had woken up that morning, her gut had screamed at her to check. So here she was, parked a few houses away, watching. She had learned a few things in the past 2 days. For one, Mark barely left the house. He worked from home, as far as she could tell, and the only time he left was to pick Lena up from daycare. Maylene, on the other hand, hadn't left the house at all. Not once. Jessica had watched for hours each evening, hoping to see Maylene step outside, even just to get the mail. But she never did. It was as if she were trapped. Jessica shifted in her seat, adjusting her position as she checked the time. 6:47 p.m. Lena should be home by now. As if on cue, the red sedan appeared at the end of the street, rolling toward the driveway. Jessica tensed, watching as Mark stepped out and opened the passenger door. Lena slid out slowly, her head down, clutching her stuffed bunny like it was the only thing keeping her together. Mark placed a firm hand on her back and guided her toward the house. Jessica's breath hitched. For a split second, Lena hesitated at the doorstep. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the street. And then she saw Jessica. Jessica didn't move, didn't blink. She just watched. Lena's tiny fingers twitched against the bunny's fur. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. Then, before she could, Mark's hand clamped down on her shoulder. She flinched, and the door slammed shut. Jessica's stomach twisted into a tight knot. She had seen it. She had proof. It wasn't just her gut feeling anymore. Lena was terrified of her father. Jessica exhaled shakily. She had to act now. This was no longer just about gathering evidence. This was about saving a child. With renewed determination, she picked up her phone and dialed. 911. What's your emergency? Jessica closed her eyes, steadying her voice. My name is Jessica Monroe. I work at Little Sprouts Daycare. I need to report a possible case of child abuse, and I have evidence. This time, she wasn't leaving anything to chance. This time, she was going to stop whatever was happening in that house, before it was too late. The reckoning. Jessica's breath trembled as she clutched the phone to her ear, her heart hammering against her ribs like a desperate warning. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but Jessica felt anything but. My name is Jessica Monroe. I work at Little Sprouts Daycare, she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to report a suspected case of child abuse. It's about a 5-year-old girl named Lena Carter. I have evidence, and I believe she's in immediate danger. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then, the dispatcher's tone turned more serious. Ma'am, can you tell me the address of the child's location? Jessica glanced at the Carter house through her windshield. The curtains were drawn, the porch light flickering weakly against the growing darkness. Yes, it's 472 Maplewood Drive. I'm parked outside. Are you currently witnessing any physical abuse happening right now? Jessica hesitated. Not at this moment, but I've seen enough. The child is terrified of her father. She flinches when he touches her. Her mother has bruises. She looked at me today like she wanted help, but she couldn't ask for it. She inhaled shakily, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. I also have a recording of a suspicious interaction, and I know this isn't enough to remove her from the home, but I need someone to check on her. Please. The dispatcher's voice softened, but there was urgency in her tone. I understand, Ms. Monroe. Officers are being dispatched to the location now. I need you to stay where you are. Do not approach the house. Jessica exhaled a heavy breath. Okay. The call ended, and for the first time since she had followed Mark's car 2 days ago, Jessica felt like she had taken the first real step towards saving Lena. But what if it wasn't enough? She had read horror stories, children who had slipped through the cracks, cases where CPS had been called too late, stories of mothers too afraid to leave, trapped in a cycle of violence. What if tonight was just another warning that Mark Carter could manipulate his way out of? Jessica's grip tightened on the steering wheel. No, not this time. 15 minutes later, flashing blue and red lights painted the quiet suburban street in eerie colors. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the Carter house. Jessica's heart pounded as she saw 2 uniformed officers step out. One of them, a tall man with a sturdy frame, walked up to the front door and knocked firmly. The other officer remained by the patrol car, speaking into his radio. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door opened. Mark Carter stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His posture was relaxed, too casual for a man whose house had just been visited by the police. "Evening, officers," he said smoothly. "Can I help you with something?" Jessica gritted her teeth. She recognized that tone. It was the same one he had used on her that night in the woods. Calm, controlled, manipulative. "We received a report of possible domestic disturbance and child endangerment," the officer said, his voice firm but professional. "We need to conduct a welfare check on your household." Mark's expression barely flickered. "A welfare check? That's ridiculous. Who called this in?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he glanced past Mark into the house. "Is your wife home?" Jessica leaned forward in her seat, watching intently. Mark hesitated. Then, as if realizing that denying them entry would only make things worse, he stepped aside. "Sure. Come in." The officers entered the house, and the door shut behind them. Jessica felt her chest tighten. "Come on. Find something." The minutes dragged. The quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed to amplify as she waited, watching the house like a hawk. No one came out. No shouts, no signs of struggle. It was like time had frozen inside those walls. Then, finally, the front door opened again. Jessica sucked in a sharp breath as she saw the officers escorting Melleen Carter out. She looked dazed, confused, like someone who had been trapped in a dream for too long and was finally waking up. Behind her, a small figure emerged. Lena. The little girl clutched her stuffed bunny, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric so tightly that Jessica thought it might tear. Mark followed, his expression carefully blank, but Jessica could see the tension in his jaw, the subtle clench of his fists. He was furious, but he was smart enough to hide it. One of the officers spoke to Melleen in hushed tones, and she nodded hesitantly. Then she turned, and her eyes locked onto Jessica's car. Jessica felt her breath hitch. For a long, painful moment, neither of them moved. Then Melleen did something that shattered the last of Jessica's restraint. She reached down, scooped Lena into her arms, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Jessica didn't need to hear the words to know what she was saying. "You're safe." The officer guided them toward one of the patrol cars, and Jessica watched as Melleen and Lena got inside. Jessica's heart clenched, a wave of relief crashing over her so strong that she nearly broke down right then and there. They were getting out. Mark, on the other hand, was still standing there, his gaze burning holes into the pavement. Then, as if sensing Jessica's eyes on him, he turned and looked straight at her. For the first time, Mark Carter's mask slipped. His lips curled into a slow, chilling smirk. Then he mouthed 2 words. "This isn't over." A shiver ran down Jessica's spine. She had won tonight. But Mark Carter wasn't the kind of man who let things go. And deep down, Jessica knew this wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just the beginning. Epilogue. The weight of choices. 2 weeks later, Jessica stood outside the courtroom, her hands gripping the file of evidence she had gathered. Melleen had pressed charges. With her statement, Lena's testimony, and Jessica's recording, they had built a case strong enough to ensure that Mark wouldn't get his daughter back without a fight. But Jessica knew men like Mark didn't give up easily, and she wasn't naive enough to think that he wouldn't find a way to seek revenge. Still, as she glanced down the hall and saw Meline and Lena sitting together, free from the fear that had once haunted them. Jessica knew one thing for sure. It had been worth it, no matter what happened next. She had saved them, and she would do it again. Because sometimes listening to your instincts wasn't just a choice. It was the only thing standing between life and tragedy.